Web remoting, PowerShell web access. Now this isn't truly remoting in the sense that you're not using PowerShell remoting. Actually, you know what? I guess that's not true. PowerShell web access does use remoting. It gives you a web-based interface into a gateway computer, which then actually uses PowerShell remoting to get you to a computer you want to manage. You can run PowerShell on your iPad or your Windows phone because you're really just interacting with it through an HTML-based interface. I'll start by showing you how to install and set this up. I'm going to do this on my member computer, which is a member of the domain, but it doesn't have any other roles installed on it, at least not right now. That's what we'll be doing. Once it's installed, I'll show you how to use PowerShell Web Access, and then we're going to kind of run into that second hop authentication issue. So I'm going to see if I can't kind of walk you through what that problem looks like and how to solve it once we run into it. Now, I'm going to start by setting up PowerShell Web Access on my member computer. Now, I'm sitting here on my Windows 7 machine, which runs PowerShell version 2. That doesn't really matter. The only thing I'm going to be using PowerShell for locally is to remote into the member machine. So here I'm going to add a Windows feature, Windows PowerShell Web Access. This is going to take a few seconds to install. When it's done, I will have the Windows PowerShell Web Access bits on member, but it won't actually be set up and running. There's another step I'll have to take. One of the bits it's going to drop onto the hard drive is a new Windows PowerShell module that's used to manage PowerShell Web Access. This thing is pretty locked down out of the gate. It's not going to allow anyone to connect to anything by default. I will have to create some rules. Now do be aware that this is a website. It runs under IIS. In fact, you can look up here at the feature result of my installation, and you can see it's added ASP.NET, it's added application development, quite a lot of stuff. So let's take a look at the modules that are now on this computer. And we should see near the end of the list, PowerShell Web Access. Get command from the module, PowerShell Web Access. Not too many commands, and the first one we're going to have to run is a function called install PSWA, PowerShell Web Access, web application. Now if you just run this thing, it's not going to set itself up correctly. First of all, PowerShell Web Access will not run over an HTTP connection from Internet Explorer or any other web browser. The connection between the browser and the web server, IIS, has to be HTTPS. So as a first step, when you do this thing normally, you're going to want to have an HTTPS or SSL certificate installed on the computer. That means in my member computer, I would want to, right now, stop, go into IIS, create a certificate request, go get an SSL certificate, and have it installed and available in IIS. However, because I'm just in a lab environment, I'm going to have it use a test certificate. I'll allow it to use the default web application name and website name, but I'm going to make it create a 90-day test certificate to run web access with. Now this will take a few seconds to complete, especially creating that self-signed certificate. Okay, that finished. Now at this point you may get excited and launch IE. Let's go to member.lab.pri/PSWA. That's the default. In fact, let me show you where you would have seen that right there. The path is PSWA. The first thing it's going to yell at you about is, dude, you came in with HTTP. We don't play that. So we got to change this to HTTPS. Because this is a test certificate, it is inherently untrusted. So I'm going to tell my computer to go ahead and go anyway. Now, I'll enter my credentials. I actually created another admin user that we can use to play with on this one. What computer do you want to connect to? Well, let's Let's, 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 connect to DC.lab.pri. Now here's some of the optional things you can do. So what's going to happen is I'm going to use this to authenticate to PowerShell Web Access. If I don't do anything else, it will impersonate, not delegate, it will impersonate that account to get to whatever computer I specified. So kind of the way this works is, let's draw a little schematic for you. I'm here on my client computer. I'm going into a web server, and it is going to make a remoting connection to whatever computer I specify, DC. So the web server is really just a gateway. The first credential, this one, covers that connection from me to the web server. If I provide a second credential, it covers the connection from the web server to the specified target computer. I can also specify a different configuration name. I can have a different type of authentication from the web server to the target, tell it to use SSL, change the port number, and so forth. But we're going to leave all of that at the default and hit sign in and fail utterly. Because remember, out of the gate, this thing doesn't allow any connections to PowerShell Web Access. We've got to come back down here and run another command. Add PSWA authorization rule. You need to specify 3 things in this authorization rule. And you can specify 4. I'm going to put a rule name. We're going to call this default configuration for admins to whatever, a computer. Bah. You need to specify the configuration name that this rule will authorize. And I'm going to use Microsoft.PowerShell. That's the default remoting configuration name, the session configuration, our endpoint. You need to specify who is allowed to connect to that configuration. And it's got to be in domain \name format. Spell it right. You can either specify a username or, in this case, a group. You also have to specify either a user group that contains computer accounts in the domain or the name of a computer. So this is going to allow this configuration on that computer to be used by those users. Oof. And I've got to do it with someone who has the right to perform Active Directory queries, because this information actually does get stored in Active Directory as an authorization rule. I'm curious. I wonder if anybody else has created any authorization rules in my environment. Nope, not seeing any on member here. So let's make sure we're logged in as the right user then. I'm going to back out of this connection. Get us a fresh screen and we'll start again. You know, I'm actually going to come clean. I was going to kind of walk you down this rabbit hole of troubleshooting because I think it simulates or it closely duplicates what a lot of people go through. Those authorization rules aren't stored in Active Directory. Here's what needed to happen. I'm sitting here on my client computer, my Windows 7 client machine. I remoted into a computer called Member. The PS authorization rules, PSWA authorization rules, they live there. However, those PSWA authorization rules incorporate elements from Active Directory. So somewhere off here, I've got a domain controller. I specified a user group name, domain admins, and I also specified a computer name. What did I specify? dc.lab.pri. Well, this computer, in order to create the authorization rule, needs to query those objects from the domain controller. Needs to get information about them, their security identifiers, and so forth. I delegated my credentials across this first hop to Member. Member is going to be allowed to do anything I'm allowed to do on this machine using those credentials. But my credentials, by default, cannot be delegated across a second hop. They can't be used across that second hop. So when Member attempted to query the information from Active Directory, it was told access denied because it was doing so anonymously. My credential couldn't go any further. This is that second hop issue. Now, as I discussed, one way that we could potentially fix this is by enabling the CRED SSP protocol. You could also set up your domain to support further levels of Kerberos delegation. You wouldn't run into this problem if you actually installed PSWA on a domain controller, right? Think about it. Let's say I did that for a second. Here's me, Windows 7. Here's my domain controller on which I've installed PowerShell Web Access. I remote into DC, that's my first hop. Everything I need is local on this machine. PSWA lives there. Active Directory lives there because it's a domain controller. I don't have to make a second hop to get to my domain controller. So if I had installed PSWA there, that attempt to create a new authorization rule would have just worked. So I've got a couple of choices. I can go back and install PSWA on my domain controller, eliminating the need for the second hop lookup, or I could mess around with CredSSP, enabling that second hop lookup. What you do in your environment is going to depend entirely on you. There's actually a third option, right? So let's go back to the scenario we find ourselves in right now. I'm on Win 7. Here's member. Member's not a domain controller, so I know it's going to have to go talk to a domain controller to look up some stuff from Active Directory. I could just log right on to member. That eliminates this first hop from client over to member, and so I don't have to worry about the delegation anymore. I could just log right onto the console of member. That's a third way I could choose to solve this problem. I'm going to try solving it by enabling CredSSP. Enable WSMan CredSSP. My role on this computer is as a client, and the delegate computers, I'm just going to say, is anyone in my local domain. I'm sure I want to do that. So it says it's set it up, and you'll notice I believe it's actually gone ahead and turned on the CredSSP protocol for me. Yep, I've just rechecked it, and it has enabled the CredSSP protocol. So now let's enter PS session, computer name, member.lab.pri, enable CredSSP role, oops, I always get that name, WSMan CredSSP, role server. I'm sure. Okay, now it has set up CredSSP as well. So I need to exit this session. I've got to create a new connection that actually uses CredSSP. Enter PS session. Let's just pull up the old command. Authentication CredSSP. When you've got to do that, you actually have to include the username and password. So let's add a credential, lab administrator. Let it prompt me for the password. And now I'm in. So let's try creating that PSWA authorization rule again and see if I've eliminated the second hop problem. Add PSWA authorization rule, computer name. Oh, so you're seeing a little display bug there. When I tab completed that, it had to actually load the module, and the PowerShell Web Access module attempts to load this PowerShell security module, but it was already loaded. So you just got that warning message. I'm just going to hit down a few lines. The fact that it showed up there was just kind of a little display bug. So let's do this again. Add PSWA authorization rule, computer name, dc.lab.pri, user group name, lab.domain.admins, configuration name, Microsoft.PowerShell, and optionally we'll put a rule name, admins to use default config on DC. That time it worked. So by using CredSSP, I was able to solve that authentication problem. Now let's go back to the web browser. I'm logging in as Joe D, who is a member of domain admins. There's his password. I'm going to try and connect to DC again. Now it works. And so what I've got here is a web HTML-based representation of the PowerShell console. I type down here, dir cd get process, whatever else. think for a second about what's really happening here, because I think it's kind of cool. I'm sitting over here on my Windows 7 computer or my smartphone or my iPad or whatever else. I've made an HTTPS connection to PowerShell Web Access. It's just a web application. It is making a WS-MAN, a remoting connection, to the computer I specified. PWA is generating this user interface, and when I type a command like get process, that command goes over here, command executes, the results get serialized into XML, sent back here. This thing uses HTML to update the display, sending it over to me and displaying it in my web browser. I think that is just awesome. And it works so well, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to log out while I geek out just a little bit more. It works so well in part because you can get very specific about who's allowed to access what. Right? Your first sort of pass is that when you come in and hit PWA, you have to tell it the computer you intend to actually manage. You don't have to manage the computer PWA is running on at all. And in this case, I didn't. PWA is running on member, and I was actually wanting to access DC. So PWA checks its authorization rules to see if the combination of your username plus the configuration you're trying to get to plus the computer you're trying to get to all passes muster. If it does, it spins up the session, creates the WS-MAN connection to whatever your target computer is, and it starts working. Remember how before I showed you how to set up a custom endpoint, a custom session configuration? You could give a specified user access to that configuration on a single computer, and they would only be able to run the commands that were present in that configuration that you set up. So the combination of all these little remoting things starts to become extremely powerful and give you an amazing amount of flexibility. Now, what do you do when you're done using your test certificate? Well, you're going to have to go get a real SSL certificate, hopefully one from your internal PKI, so you don't have to pay for it. You're going to install that into the computer account of the web server. Get the certificate's thumbprint or hash. So once it's installed, it'll show up in this directory listing. That's a little spurious of an error message there. You'll be able to get its hash or thumbprint. Import module web administration. If you do a get binding, get web binding, and let's just do the HTTPS protocol, and we'll select all. Whoops. Let's try that again. Get web binding. I did port. Just watch me for the typos, man. There we go. You'll see that one of the things in this binding binds HTTPS on all IP addresses to port 443 using this certificate. The certificate came out of the My Certificate Store, which is the computers. And it's connected to the default website. It's probably connected to more than just that too, because it's what PowerShell Web Access is using. So let's take a look inside cert and see if we can find that certificate. dir cert -recur starts with C001. There it is, C001. There's the certificate for the PowerShell Web Access test website. So you install your new SSL certificate, get its thumbprint, and you run set web binding. You set the web binding on whatever that binding is, IP address, port, and you set the certificate thumbprint to be that new certificate. So the certificate hash and then the thumbprint would go there. That tells IIS to use the new permanent real SSL certificate instead. Obviously, if you're not super happy doing that through PowerShell, then you can do it through the IIS graphical console as well. And that's a place you can go to create the certificate request, retrieve the certificate, install the certificate, select the certificate for that particular website, and so on. So you'll definitely want to eventually do that if you get this up and running in production. So now you know how to set up, install PowerShell Web Access, and how to use the thing. Keep in mind that SSL certificate is crucial. You really want to think about that hard before you even start setting this thing up. Keeping in mind that if you do set this up and you don't specify a real certificate or a test certificate, it gets significantly harder to get it set up after that. I also kind of ran you into that authentication issue and got Cred SSP up and running so that you can see that working. That's a really valuable technique, since one of the things you'll be doing a lot with PowerShell Web Access is kind of hopping around within your data center over that initial remoting connection. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.